Truth in My Days podcast is sponsored by the Truth in My Days ministry. Welcome to the Truth in My Days podcast, where we defend the Word of God against the challenges of men.
Hello, this is Sonia. I'm here with Truth in My Days director John Torse. John, Christmas is approaching, and I know that the accounts in the Bible of Jesus' birth are favorite targets for liberal scholars and skeptics to attack, aren't they?
Oh, yes. I remember the days when news magazines like Time and Newsweek and Maclean's used to bring out twice every year cover stories about Jesus. One would be around Christmas, one would be around Easter. And each of these issues would make claims about the accounts in the Bible not being reliable. They would have several pages all interviewing liberal scholars, attacking the reliability of the biblical accounts. And they would make bald assertions. They never offered anything in the way of proof. But yes, certainly Christmas is one of those times when liberal skeptics crawl out of the woodwork to attack the Bible.
So what is it that they say is so unreliable?
When it comes to the Christmas story, there are several things they attack, but the one that they focus on most is the date of Jesus' birth. And I don't mean the month and day, I mean the year. There are birth narratives only in Matthew and in Luke, and the claim that the liberal skeptics make is that these two books give conflicting data about when Jesus was born, and this conflicting data is impossible to reconcile. Even some well-known evangelical scholars concede this to be the single most intractable problem regarding the historical reliability of the New Testament.
Oh, that sounds interesting. What is the supposed contradiction?
This is one that's not in the biblical text itself. The contradiction is supposedly between what the Bible says and known historical facts. So let's start by reading the two accounts. Could you read for us Luke chapter 2, verses 1 to 6?
And it came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. So all went to be registered, everyone to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee, out of the city of Nazareth, into Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed wife, who was with child. So it was that while they were there, the days were completed for her to be delivered.
Thank you. And the account from Matthew, in Matthew starting in chapter 2, verses 1 to 3, we read this. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and have come to worship him. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And then in verse 16 we read, Then Herod, when he saw that he was deceived by the wise men, was exceedingly angry, and he sent forth and put to death all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its districts from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had determined from the wise men. And then in verses 19 to 22, we read, Now when Herod was dead, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, Arise, take the young child and his mother, and go to the land of Israel, for those who sought the young child's life are dead. Then he arose, took the young child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. But when he heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea instead of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. Now, these are all very nice, familiar stories associated with Christmas. We enjoy listening to them, reading them every year. But liberal skeptics and critics are quick to pounce and argue that these very accounts show that the gospel books are not historically reliable.
Okay, what's the charge?
Well, it has to do with this. Notice in the account in Matthew, we're told that Jesus was born in the days of Herod the king. We have several references to Herod. Jesus' family ends up fleeing to Egypt, and they return after Herod is dead. And you saw that in Matthew 2:19-22, when Herod was dead, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, "Arise, take the young child and his mother and go to the land of Israel." So, question then is, who is this Herod the king? You've probably noticed, if you read the New Testament, a bunch of Herods running around in the pages of the New Testament, and sometimes we can get confused and think this Herod is the same as that Herod, and that's not the case. There are actually a number of Herods. The one here in the Christmas story is the one known as Herod the Great, who essentially was the founder of this particular dynasty. He is the one who appears in Matthew chapter 2, the references we read out. He had sons by 4 different wives, and out of these sons, some of them became kings, or at least tetrarchs. One of his sons, born of Malthasa, a Samaritan woman, is this Archelaus that you read about in Matthew 2:22, who took over in Judea after Herod the Great died. So that's another Herod Archelaus, but he's only mentioned as Archelaus. Archelaus's brother is Herod Antipas, same mother. He is the one we see in Mark chapter 6. He is the one who is the king in Judea during Jesus' ministry. He's the one who has John the Baptist put to death in Mark chapter 6. He's the one that Jesus is brought before for an examination. That's recorded only in Luke chapter 23, verses 6-12. And then there's Herod Agrippa the First. And Herod Agrippa the First is a son of Aristobulus, who was born of a different wife of Herod the Great, Mariamne, a Hasmonean Jew. And that's the Herod that you read about in Acts chapter 12, the one who has James, the brother of John, put to death, and then shortly after accepts accolades as a god and finds himself struck and dead in the year 44. So there are these different Herods in the different accounts in the Bible story. And the one in the Christmas story, though, as we said, is the founder of the dynasty, Herod the Great. So Jesus, according to Matthew, was born while Herod was still alive. And we're told that according to history, Herod died in 4 BC, which would mean that Jesus was born before 4 BC, maybe as early as 6 BC. And you wonder, how could Jesus be born before Christ? Well, that's not really a problem. In those days, nobody counted years from Jesus' birth, obviously. They generally counted them ab urbe condita, the founding of the city of Rome. It was not until centuries later that a monk named Dionysius Exiguus, Dennis the Short, tried to get a new dating system going back to the birth of Jesus, and he might have been off a bit. But that's not a problem. The problem comes, the supposed problem, when we cross-reference this story in Luke. It came to pass in those days that a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. So all went to be registered, everyone to his own city. Joseph also went up from Galilee out of the city of Nazareth. So it's this census proclaimed, decreed by Caesar Augustus, that is the reason that Joseph goes to Bethlehem with his wife Mary, and Jesus then is born in Bethlehem. Now, the supposed problem is that we read this census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria, but we are told that ancient records tell us that Quirinius became governor of Syria in the year AD 6. So now do you see the problem?
Oh, so other accounts tell us that Quirinius would have not become governor until after Jesus was born.
Depending on when Jesus was born. But yes, that's the problem. How could Jesus have been born before Herod died and also be born during a census that first took place at least 10 years after Herod died? Remember, Herod, we're told, died in the year 4 BC. This census first took place in the year AD 6. So 10 years difference. How could Jesus' parents go to Bethlehem when Quirinius was governing Syria in AD 6 or later, and also do it during the reign of Herod, who died in 4 BC.
And it couldn't have been one of those other Herods after all?
No, the other Herods were born far too late for that. They're not born far too late, but took office too late. Now, virtually every reference book you check will say that Herod died in 4 BC. The Oxford Bible Commentary says Herod died in 4 BC. Paul Tobin, in The Rejection of Pascal's Wager, writes it was Herod who initiated the rebuilding of the temple. He did not live to see its completion, for he died in 4 BCE. Now, could it possibly be in a different Herod? The problem with that is we read in Matthew that when Joseph is returning after the death of Herod, he was afraid to go to Judea because Herod's son Archelaus was now ruling in Judea. Well, Archelaus replaced Herod the Great, not another Herod. So no, it couldn't have been another Herod. So here's the problem. We read that Herod died in 4 BC, and evangelical scholars agree with this. John MacArthur in the MacArthur Study Bible writes, for in the days of Herod the Great, Herod the King, this refers to Herod the Great. This Herod, founder of the famous line, ruled from 37 to 4 BC. The New Bible Dictionary tells us Herod the Great, King of the Jews, 40 to 4 BC. The New International Greek Testament Commentary on Luke says Herod the Great, ruler of Judea, 50 to 5 or 4 BC. So, remember, Quirinius was supposed to be governor at this time, but according to the Oxford Bible Commentary, Herod died in 4 BCE, and Quirinius was not governor of Syria until 6 or 7 CE. And it dryly adds, attempts to reconcile the differences have not met with widespread endorsement. And again, evangelical scholars agree that this is a problem. Again, MacArthur, in the MacArthur Study Bible, Quirinius was governing Syria. Fixing a precise date for this census is problematic. Publius Sulpicius Quirinius is known to have governed Syria during AD 6 to 9. A well-known census was taken in Palestine in AD 6. It occurred about a decade after the death of Herod. Dr. Darrell Bach writes this, another good historical problem Dr. Arman raises is the issue of Quirinius' census. Quirinius is the governor who is associated with the changeover from Archelaus being removed as the ruler of Judea to the appointment of a Roman prefect to take over that responsibility. In the time of 6 AD, Quirinius filled this role similar to what Pilate would later. The argument is that we know Quirinius was ruler in 6 AD, but this is too late to represent Jesus' birth and be the explanation for why Mary and Joseph have come south from Nazareth down into Judea and to Bethlehem. This is certainly correct. We do have a historical anomaly here at this point.
Is there any chance that Quirinius could have been governor twice?
Some do make that suggestion, and we will look at that when we look at the different possible solutions. Suffice it to say here that Dr. Bach says this is a good historical problem, and even raises the possibility, another response is that it is possible Luke had this kind of detail incorrect. It is conceivable. Daniel Wallace, he writes this text, he's speaking of Luke 2:2, this text casts serious doubts on Luke's accuracy for 2 reasons. One, the earliest known Roman census in Palestine was taken in 6 to 7 CE, and 2, there is little, if any, evidence that Quirinius was governor of Syria before Herod's death in 4 BCE. In light of this, many scholars believe that Luke was thinking about the census in 6 to 7 CE when Quirinius was governor of Syria.
On the other hand, it doesn't quite sound like he's totally cutting off the possibility. I mean, earliest known Roman census, like there could have been one that's just not mentioned by other sources, and little, if any, evidence, but just because we don't have it somewhere else that he was governor before Herod's death in 4 BC doesn't mean it's impossible, does it?
Well, it may not, but the reason Wallace says this casts serious doubts on Luke's accuracy is To skeptics and to many people, it just seemed like special pleading to say, well, we have no evidence that he governed before, but he probably did, or maybe he did. If you make a positive assertion, there's a burden of proof on you. And furthermore, Tobin, whom we mentioned earlier, gives us a list of governors of Syria, recorded governors of Syria, and claims on the basis of that list that there's no place to pigeonhole Quirinius in at the required time. So this is why Wallace will tell us that this casts serious doubts on Luke's accuracy, and it should be noted how evangelical scholars are ready to question the accuracy of the gospel books. Well, let's sum up the charges to this point and take a look at them in detail, because this is just part of it. There's more. Charges. It is impossible to reconcile Matthew's claim that Jesus was born before the death of Herod with Luke's claim that Jesus was born while Quirinius was governing Syria, since Herod died in 4 BC and Quirinius did not become governor of Syria until AD 6. And as we mentioned, this is perhaps the single most common attack on the historical reliability of the gospel books that are levied by skeptics. But there's more. They also claim that there's no historical record of a census of the entire Roman world. Well, we see Luke says that Caesar Augustus decreed that the entire Roman world should be registered, and they say there's no historical evidence of any census of the entire Roman world. Censuses, we're told, were done piecemeal and involved only Roman citizens. We're also told that no Roman census would have been made in Judea during the reign of Herod, because Herod was a client king, so he had a certain degree of autonomy in Judea. We're told that Roman censuses did not require people to return to their ancestral homes, but to where they owned property. These are the various charges brought against the birth narratives of Jesus. So let's now look at the way evangelicals seek to respond to these, see if there's any validity to these attempts, see what their strengths and weaknesses are, and then see if we can come up with something else that might be better. So, the first attempt at defense is to say that the census may have been conducted by an earlier governor, perhaps Saturninus.
How's that a defense?
Well, it isn't much of one, really, because Luke does specify that it was done while Quirinius was governing Syria. So this supposed defense would be admitting that Luke made a serious blunder here, which would, in fact, undercut the trustworthiness of the accounts, which is exactly what liberal scholars are doing, or trying to do here. Another attempt is to say that, this is from Bach, my own solution is that Augustus got organized to take this census, and the mechanizations of it took place somewhere between 6 BC and 4 BC, but the census was not actually executed until Quirinius. In other words, the census was taken under Augustus, then Quirinius took the data, put it together, and presented it to Rome. So Rome actually began to make use of it for taxation under Quirinius. Do you see a problem with that attempted defense?
Well, while Quirinius was governing, it doesn't sound like he came into the picture later. It sounds like it's contemporaneous.
Yes, it doesn't say in the text that the census was finished when Quirinius was governing, but that it was first done when Quirinius was governing. So it's a similar sort of problem as to the first defense. If we're told that, well, Quirinius is just putting the data together and actually the census was done before him, well, then we're back to the same problem. It must have been done under a different governor. And it would be the same error that we have in the first place. And you also wonder if Luke is describing the birth narrative of Jesus, why is he appealing to something that might have happened 10 years later to situate it in time and place? That's not Luke's usual style. If you look at passages like Luke 3:1, he ties his narrative into the historical events at the time. If you look at Luke 3:1, he talks about who was governing where and who was holding what position when at the time that John the Baptist begins his ministry. Not, well, who was doing something 10 years later. That wouldn't seem to make sense. Another attempted defense, then, is to say that perhaps the decree and the census were two distinct events. The decree first, and the census 10 years later. Does that sound viable?
Not really. I guess I have to go back and read the passage to see if there's a way to twist it. Fit it in like that.
Good choice of words there, yeah. The text clearly has Joseph and Mary going to Bethlehem for the census when Jesus was born. The census was therefore not 10 years later. It absolutely makes no sense that the Roman emperor would decree that a census be done and people drag their heels for 10 years before they get around to obeying the emperor. That seems to be a rather desperate expedient. Now, a variation of that is to say that perhaps there were two distinct events, the census, and then 10 years later, the levying of taxes based on the census. So the decree goes out earlier and the census is done earlier, but then it's used to levy taxes 10 years later during Quirinius' time. Does that one sound reasonable?
No.
I wouldn't think so. The text actually says nothing about taxes. It says the census during which Jesus was born was done when Quirinius was governing Syria, not that some later taxation was done when Quirinius was governing Syria.
Would they have had to travel there to be taxed?
That's another claim from the skeptics, the liberal scholars, that no, they wouldn't have had to. But we'll get to that challenge as well. And I think the reason this may come up and why some make a mistake is if you read in the old King James Version, this is what you read. And it came to pass in those days that there went out a decree from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be taxed. And this taxing was first made when Cyrenius was governor of Syria, and all went to be taxed, everyone into his own city. So you see, all the world should be taxed. This tax thing was first made, all went to be taxed. It doesn't say tax. You won't see that in, say, the New King James Version, because the word is not the word for tax. The word is the word for registered and census, not for taxing.
So that's just a mistake in King James Version, or is it based on a different text?
It's a mistranslation in the King James Version. King James Version and New King James Version, New Testaments use the same text. Now here's another one. Perhaps Quirinius conducted two censuses. The first during the time of Jesus' birth, and the second in AD 6. Sound reasonable?
Well, it seems weird that they'd have the censuses so close together.
That may seem a little strange, yes. And again, some would say this is special pleading because there's no evidence of this putative earlier census. And we're told he could not have done one in Judea while Herod was king anyway. So how did he do this earlier one? Now, here's another one that you might find more interesting. And this defense says Luke 2:2 should be translated, this census took place before Quirinius was governing Syria, instead of this census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. If it could be translated that way, would that solve the problem?
I guess it could.
It could. It would raise the question why, again, tie it into history before to something that happens after the fact. Maybe because the census done by Quirinius was much better known, so Luke is trying to specify this as one that was done before that one you're thinking of. However, let's hear what Daniel Wallace has to say in response. Can you read this to us and then give us your expert opinion?
Okay, so he says, prote is sometimes regarded as adverbial. This census took place before Quirinius was governor of Syria. The advantage of this approach is that it eludes the historical problem of Quirinius' governorship overlapping the reign of Herod. However, it erroneously presupposes that haute modifies apographe. But since the construction is anarthrous, such a view is almost impossible, because when a demonstrative functions attributively to a noun, the noun is almost always articular.
You think you can explain that to our readers?
Okay, so when you have a word like this or that describing a noun, like this census, Greek has to use the word the, like say something like this the census, but where we wouldn't say it like that in English, but for their construction they have to have it there. But in this case, there is no word the in the Greek, so it's not allowable to translate it like that.
And that's Wallace's responses, and this is why Wallace is concerned about this issue. No article there, you can't translate it this way. What if the article is there, though? Could you do it then?
Well, let's see, what would the text look like then?
It would look like this.
The word order looks a little bit weird, but...
Well, the order is exactly the same. The only difference is the insertion of that article. Now, Wallace told us you can't translate it as before because the article is not there. Okay, that's the only objection. If the article is there, you could translate that way. And look at that. How many of the manuscripts actually have the article in it there?
Oh, 99.4%.
Exactly. How many of them are missing the article?
0.6%.
Yeah, so here's the problem. This is an issue of textual criticism. We haven't really talked about this yet. We will. The reality is the article is there in the Greek text. So this is a viable solution. There's a very, very few manuscripts, 0.6%, 6 out of every 1,000 manuscripts that have accidentally dropped out the article. Unfortunately, Wallace believes that that's the correct original text. He believes, therefore, that the article was not there, and so it cannot be translated that way.
Well, okay, Wallace believes that, but what about all those other authors in those other books that you cited?
Every scholar who accepts the critical text as closest to the original will side with Wallace on this and will rule out this solution. And they all do. So we'll get into that in more detail when we cover the issue of textual criticism. Now, some would say that even with the article there, there's something about the syntactical construction that would make that translation clumsy. But it's certainly viable. And if we go that route, that is a solution.
So is that the end of the story then?
No, it's a possible solution, but it's, as I say, even syntactically, it's questionable. And certainly you're not going to convince skeptical scholars who all believe that the article is not there in that verse. I think we can see an awful lot more about how scholarship works and where it falls down on the job. Wallace, who believes that the article is not there, and therefore you cannot translate it this way, goes on to say, in conclusion, facile solutions do not come naturally to Luke 2:2. This does not, of course, mean that Luke erred. In agreement with Sherman, Marshall warns against too easy acceptance of the conclusion that Luke has gone astray here. Only the discovery of new historical evidence can lead to a solution of the problem. This is where we must leave the matter. So what Wallace is saying is basically, yeah, as far as we can see, based on all the evidence we have, there's no solution to this problem. But hey, we shouldn't accept the idea that this is a problem because, hey, maybe someday we might discover some new historical evidence to solve the problem.
But hasn't that happened for other historical matters in the Bible, like skeptics claiming that this particular people didn't exist and you couldn't answer them at the time, but later on archaeological evidence reveals that there was in fact such a people?
Yeah, the difference there is that was always an argument from silence. When the Bible talked about, say, the Hittites, and they said that Hittites didn't exist, it wasn't because they had any positive evidence against the existence of Hittites. It's simply because they hadn't found evidence yet. Here, the evidence we've found is what supposedly causes the problem. It's not simply people saying, well, we don't have evidence, therefore Luke made a mistake. They're saying, we have the evidence, and the evidence shows that Luke made a mistake. And what Wallace is saying, well, yeah, he's agreeing, basically, the evidence we have does agree that he made a mistake, but maybe someday we'll find some more historical evidence that will turn the situation around. Does that sound like it's going to give confidence to Christians or anybody in the reliability of the New Testament?
No.
I wouldn't think so either. So let's see if we can do better. Okay? And again, remembering that certainly translating as before Quirinius was governor of Syria is an option. But let's see what else we can do. Former United States President Ronald Reagan, in dealing with the Soviets, this famous dictum where he said, trust but verify. Trust but verify. I would say that when it comes to New Testament scholarship or biblical scholarship in general, we should have a little different dictum, and that is never trust, always verify. Always go to see what is the evidence on which the claim is based, And it doesn't matter if you're talking about liberal or evangelical scholarship. Liberal scholarship, we've looked at this a bit before, but it started out with the assumption that supernatural is impossible, and the scholarship was basically to try to debunk Christianity and explain Jesus away as just an ordinary person. And too many of the claims they made, the presuppositions, paradigm assumptions, evangelicals do buy into. So you can never trust, always verify. How do you do that? Well, you need to engage in critical thinking. There are 3 key questions you always have to ask. Anytime you're a person make an assertion, it's a bald assertion, he said something is this way, he hasn't given you evidence, you always have to ask, how do you know? What is your evidence? What are you leaving out? And you have to remember to ask these questions. So let's ask these questions as we look at the charges again. The charge: it is impossible to reconcile Matthew's claim that Jesus was born before the death of Herod with Luke's claim that Jesus was born while Quirinius was governing Syria, since Herod died in 4 BC and Quirinius did not become governor of Syria until AD 6. So in regard to these charges, what are our scholars not asking that they should be asking?
Well, how do they know Herod died in 4 BC and Quirinius became governor in 86?
Exactly. How do we know Herod died in 4 BC? How do we know Quirinius did not become governor of Syria until AD 6? They just accept the claims? Nobody seems to bother to double check them to see if these are actually true, because if those dates are not correct, the whole situation can change. So we have to ask, how do you know Herod died in 4 BC? What is your evidence? How do you know that Quirinius became governor of Syria in AD 6? What is your evidence? Well, the statements are made generally with such confidence that no one thinks to ask. Well, we're going to ask. We're going to look into this. So the first thing we have to do is, how do we know that Herod died in 4 BC? What is that claim based on? Well, it's based mainly on the writings of Josephus. And Josephus was that Jewish historian who lived in the 1st century from about the year 37 to the year 100. He joined with the Jewish rebels in 66 in that rebellion against Rome that ended up with the destruction of the temple. But he managed to ingratiate himself with the Roman emperor and lived out the rest of his days in Rome, writing massive volumes of histories. And they're pretty much the best sources we have for the 1st century history, particularly of anything having to do with Israel. They are the best sources. Now, Josephus, in his book Antiquities of the Jews, section 14.14.5, tells us this. Antony also feasted Herod the 1st day of his reign, and thus did this man receive the kingdom, having obtained it on the 184th Olympiad, which was 40 BC, when Caius Domitius Calvinus was consul the 2nd time, and Caius Asinius Pollio. Now, we have a problem here. It's impossible. The 184th Olympiad ended in mid-AD 40, whereas the consulship of these two men listed began in late AD 40 and went into 39. So even in this one paragraph, Josephus contradicts himself. So which of those is correct, 40 or 39? Well, here we have to cross-reference Josephus with a Roman historian named Appian. Appian writes of civil war, including the appointment of Herod, but he doesn't give us a date for the appointment of Herod. But we can cross-reference some of the events here with writings of yet another Roman historian, Dio Cassius, who describes the same events without mentioning Herod. So you compare these different sources, you do get the date. This happened in the year 39 BC, not AD, BC. Happened in 39 BC. Okay, so it wasn't 40 and it wasn't on the 184th Olympiad. So furthermore, Josephus is clear that it was a midwinter trip and that his friend Antony was there, Antonius. But Antonius wasn't there in the winter of 41 to 40 or 39 to 38. So it had to be 39 BC. So that's the first thing to know. We can fix the start of Herod's reign to 39 BC. And we know right away that Josephus is not exactly that super accurate historian that we might like him to be. But let's continue. Josephus goes on to tell us this. Herod obtained the kingship for himself when he had Antigonus killed, quote, when Marcus Agrippa and Caninius Gallus were consuls of Rome on the 185th Olympiad on the third month on the solemnity of the fast. So that's AD 37. And then in Antiquities in section 17.8.1, he tells us this. When he had done these things, he died the 5th day after he had caused Antipater to be slain, having reigned, since he had procured Antigonus to be slain, 34 years, but since he had been declared king by the Romans, 37. Now, isn't that interesting? If he took office in 39 BC and he reigned 37, what does that take you to?
2 BC.
2 BC, not 4. Not 4.
So why does everyone think it's 4 BC?
We'll see why. It becomes a little problem for them with 2 BC. Josephus goes on to tell us that Philip the Tetrarch, who was mentioned in the Bible, remember this is the Philip who was married to Herodias, and Herodias divorced Philip to marry Herod. Remember John the Baptist giving Herod a hard time, saying it is not lawful for you to have your brother's wife?
Oh, and that's what got him beheaded.
That's what ended up getting him beheaded in the end, yes. It's that Philip the Tetrarch. Now, Josephus tells us that Philip started his reign in 4 or 3 BC. Now, about this time, it was Philip, Herod's brother, departed his life in the 20th year of the reign of Tiberius, after he had been Tetrarch of Trachonitis and Gaulonitis, and of the nation of the Batanians also 37 years. Then we also find out this, and here's where you get a fun thing. Herod died after a lunar eclipse. In Antiquity 17.6.4, Josephus writes, Herod deprived this Matthias of the high priesthood and burnt the other Matthias, who had raised the sedition with his companions alive, and that very night there was an eclipse of the moon. Josephus, in the next few sections, tells of the events between the eclipse and the death of Herod, and then between his death and Passover. So, his death can be linked in close proximity to a lunar eclipse. Well, we can calculate back when lunar eclipses happened, and we do. And we find there was a lunar eclipse on March 13th, 4 BC, about 29 days before Passover. So here's the problem. See, 2 BC, 3 BC supposedly doesn't have the eclipse they need. 4 BC does. So they backdate. Instead of 3 BC, they go to 4 BC to match the eclipse. So when they say it's based on data in Josephus, it isn't really. It has to be adjusted. His chronological data doesn't line up with what he said about the eclipse. And they'll go with the eclipse, and they will put his death into the year 4 BC. And that's how he came up with it. Now, does that sound convincing so far?
It sounds like there are all these confusing little mistakes. It's even hard to keep track.
It is, yeah. But let's see where the trouble now begins. Well, we saw before about when Herod obtained the kingship from. We looked at that, 37 BC. It looks convincing, but wait. Okay. As we pointed out, he also gave us this other information, and they don't agree with each other. We already saw that it couldn't have been in mid-40, had to have been in 39. We saw that, 39 BC. We look at Appian's data, cross-reference with Dio Cassius, as we said. We bring the beginning of Herod's reign to 39 BC. We saw what he said in Josephus about Antony feasting with Herod the first day of his reign. The bottom line, as we pointed out, Herod was proclaimed king in 39 BC. 39 BC is the only possible date based on everything that we've been told by Josephus.
How do our liberal scholars deal with this?
Well, as we've seen, that date of 40 BC for the start of Herod's reign is not possible. The date isn't really coming from Josephus, but instead of doing the sort of analysis we're doing, they just keep stating 40 BC so that they can come up with a date of 4 BC for Herod's death. But if we look back at this statement, remember where it says that Herod obtained the kingship for himself when he had Antigonus killed, and this was supposedly in the year 37 BC. The 185th Olympiad, which we showed is not really viable. If we continue that quote, we read this, that this happened as if a periodical revolution of calamities had returned since that which befell the Jews under Pompey. For the Jews were taken by him on the same day, and this was after 27 years' time. So Josephus here gives us another time indicator that this happened 27 years after Pompey captured Jerusalem, but that happened in the year 63 BC. So this takes us now to 36 BC, not 37 BC. Okay, so once again, it's 3 years after 39 BC, not 40 BC. And then there's more. We have to ask the question of how did Josephus count regnal years?
What's a regnal year?
This has to do with how the ancients counted a period of a man's reign. They had two different ways to do it, what's called inclusive and what's called factual. An inclusive would include the partial year of ascension as a full year. So in other words, if a king took the throne with only 1 month left in that calendar year, it would still be counted as a full year for his reign. The factual method actually counted only full years.
Did it account for partial years, like having fractions or anything like that?
Generally, no. We do that today, of course. The question is, how did Josephus do it? Because this becomes crucial to see how many years we can attribute to Herod. Now, we read, Steinman from Abraham to Paul, he tells us every other reign in this period, including those of the Jewish high priests, are reckoned non-inclusively by Josephus. So in other words, where it's factually. So that means that we should expect he did the same thing for Herod, which means that the partial 39 BC would not have been counted. When Josephus counts the years for Herod to be in power, it would have started from 38 BC. He was in power for 37 years, and that takes you to 1 BC, not 4 BC.
Okay, but what about the eclipse?
Well, that's another interesting issue. I'll get to it in a moment. But there's another problem that you might remember.
Okay, what about the fact that his sons dated their reign from 4 or 3 BC?
Yes, this would be a problem. As we've added up the data in Josephus, we actually reach a death date of Herod of 1 BC, and yet supposedly his sons dated their reign from 4 or 3 BC. So why did Herod not die then? Well, we read in Josephus Antiquities, this is section 18.4.6, about this time it was Philip, Herod's brother, departed his life in the 20th year of the reign of Tiberius, after he had been tetrarch of Trachonitis and Gaulonitis, and of the nation of the Batanians, also 37 years.
What's the significance of that?
The significance is this fellow was actually executed by Herod. He was executed by Herod. And again, we read in Josephus describing this. Herod is obviously still alive at this point. He says, upon Herod saying this, he was interrupted by the confusion he was in, but ordered Nicolaus, one of his friends, to produce the evidence against Antipater. But in the meantime, Antipater, this is one of Herod's sons, lifted up his head, for he lay on the ground before his father's feet, and cried out aloud, Thou, O Father, hast made my apology for me, for how can I be a parricide, whom thou thyself confessest to have always had for thy guardian? And indeed, what was there that could possibly provoke me against thee? Could the hope of being king do it? I was a king already. You understand the significance of that?
So he was king even though Herod was alive?
Yes, and that's not unusual for kings to name their sons as co-regents or kings even before they die. That was not at all a rare practice in the ancient world. So if Antipater was already a king while Herod was still alive, it means any of his sons, including Philip, could also have been a king before he died. So if Herod issued coins in 4 BC or 3 BC that identified himself as king, that in and of itself does not mean that Herod was dead by that point. So that one stumbling block for our date of Herod's death disappears.
Okay, what was the eclipse, though?
What about the eclipse? Okay, that's a good question. Was there an eclipse in 4 BC? To put Herod's death in 4 BC, they need an eclipse. Now remember, the data from Josephus, they misinterpreted to give you 3 BC, where there was no eclipse, so they've backdated to 4 BC because there was a lunar eclipse on March 13th of that year. And this is taken to be the one to which Josephus was referring. You remember we read out Josephus in Antiquities. We read that Herod deprived this Matthias of the high priesthood and burnt the other Matthias who had raised the sedition with his companions alive, and that very night there was an eclipse of the moon. And then he goes on to tell us the events between the eclipse and the death of Herod, and then between his death and Passover. So there was this lunar eclipse, March 13th, 4 BC, and that's taken to be the one mentioned by Josephus. The question is it? Is it? Okay. According to the standard explanation, Herod was proclaimed king in 40 BC. Herod ruled 37 years. As we said, that takes you to 3 BC, not 4 BC. There was no eclipse in 3 BC, so Herod's death has to be backdated to 4 BC. So the standard explanation that you see that Herod died in 4 BC does not accord with the data given to us in Josephus. There seems to be a contradiction if indeed that was the eclipse to which Josephus referred to.
Well, could you really have had more than one lunar eclipse in such close succession?
Well, you could, and you did actually. And that's the interesting thing. There was a lunar eclipse, this one March 13th, 4 BC. There were no lunar eclipses in 3 BC, as we've said, or 2 BC. But there were 2 lunar eclipses in 1 BC, which is the very year on which Josephus' data converges. Now, the March 13th, 4 BC lunar eclipse, we have a problem here. It began after midnight local time. The umbral period where you could actually start noticing the shadow on the moon didn't begin until 1:38 a.m. And its maximum covered only 36% of the moon. With 36% covered, only 36%, there would have been no reddening of the moon. The moon would have seemed bright with only a small smudge at the corner. And it concluded at 5 in the morning. So even if anyone were awake to see it, they would hardly have noticed. It certainly would not have been significant or remembered. And if that's the case, it becomes very questionable to assume that's the one to which Josephus was referring. If we look at the 2 in 1 BC, however, it's a different story. One happened on January 10th of that year. It lasted from about 11:28 at night to 3:03 in the morning. It was a full eclipse. It was centered over 15 degrees east longitude, which meant it was perfect for viewing from Jerusalem. It was visible for almost an hour around midnight. Its maximum totality, when it's fully eclipsed, was 1:15 a.m. So that one certainly would have been noticed and remembered. There was another one much later in the year, December 29th. This umbral contact was from 3:28 in the afternoon. And at that point, the moon wouldn't really have been visible in the sky yet. And this was 53% eclipsed. So there were two lunar eclipses near 1 BC, both of which were a better candidate to be noticed than the one in 4 BC, which almost certainly would not have been noticed. The January 10th one seems to be the better case, though. Much more visible, much more noticeable.
If that's the case, why would anyone assume it was the insignificant one if there are those 2 perfectly good ones in 1 BC?
Well, once they have misread Josephus to calculate that Herod died in 3 BC, they're looking for the closest eclipse, and the closest they find is 4 BC. Okay? I don't, and some of them may not. These are not astronomers. These are Bible scholars. I don't know if they bothered even to look at the details of the eclipse. They might just have heard there's one in 4 BC and not examine the facts to see whether it even would have been noticed by the people or not. But the fact as we've seen them is no, they would not have been noticed.
Although I guess someone must have noticed the 4 BC one for it to have been recorded like that.
It wasn't recorded. This was all based on astronomical calculations we do now, based on the motion of the stars, planets, and moon as we understand it.
Oh.
Concluding this part of what we've talked about, when did Herod die? It was not 4 BC, it was 1 BC. Which means that when Jesus was born, it would have been perhaps late, it would have been 2 BC. Possibly very early 1 BC, but most likely in 2 BC. Okay? Now, that doesn't quite solve the problem because that's a lot closer than 4 BC. But supposedly, if Quirinius didn't start governing until AD 6, you still don't get the proper overlap. So what do you think we should do next?
Well, I guess we have to look at the data for Quirinius now.
Exactly. Remember our principle, never trust, always verify. Asking the questions, how do you know? What is your evidence? What are you leaving out? You can't just, as we did with Herod, we can't just accept the claim that Herod died in 4 BC. We need to go over the evidence. We found Herod died in 1 BC, which means Jesus would have been born in 2 BC, perhaps. And that fits the biblical data much better as well, because Jesus began his ministry, according to the data in Luke 3:1, about the year 30, AD 30, and we're told he was about 30 years of age. So he would have been, say, 31 at that time, maybe 31 and a half, which fits well with Luke's designation. If he'd been born in 4 BC, he would have been 34, pushing 35 by that time, which is not exactly about 30. So this, we've got this part straight now. Herod died in 1 BC, but we still have this problem with Quirinius, so we have to do the same thing with Quirinius that we did with Herod. Ask the question, how do you know Quirinius became governor of Syria in the year AD 6? What is your evidence for that? That's the question that needs to be asked that nobody seems to ask. The statements are made with such confidence that no one thinks to ask. No one seems to think to ask. Well, we're going to ask. And when we do, it looks like there's a lot of data for it. Reading from, I believe it's a book by John Loftus. He's quoting Paul Tobin. We read that Quirinius's career is relatively well documented in our primary sources. Tacitus's Annals of Imperial Rome, 322-23 and 348. Suetonius's Tiberius, section 49. Strabo's Geography, section 12.6.5. And Josephus's Antiquities of the Jews, section 17.3.5 and 18.1.1. all mention aspects of his career. From these accounts, we know that he was born somewhere before 50 BCE and that he died in 22 CE. We know that he was a consul of Rome by 12 BCE. He was in Asia Minor between 12 and 6 BCE, where he fought the war against the Homonadenses. He was the governor of Pamphylia, Galatia between 6 and 1 BCE, and he was serving as the advisor for Gaius Caesar for several years before 4 CE. Josephus mentioned Quirinius several times when he became governor of Syria in 6 CE. So we read of Quirinius' career spanning 20 years from 12 BCE to 6 CE, yet not once was he mentioned as taking over the governorship of Syria at any time during the reign of Herod. The conclusion is inescapable. Quirinius could not have been governor of Syria twice. So does that sound pretty conclusive?
Okay, I'm not... I after hearing all those little facts, I still don't really get how that means he couldn't have been governor of Syria twice.
That's a good question. But here's the thing. our author lists all these sources: Tacitus, Anno, Suetonius, Tiberius, Strabo's Geography, Josephus, Antiquities of the Jews. And you think with all these sources, they can't be wrong, can they?
Well, the author said they all mention aspects of his career. If we're just looking for when he was the governor of Syria, then are they all mentioning that particular aspect?
And that's exactly the way to ask questions. That's exactly the thing to look at. When you do that, you will find that this is all bluff, folks. It's bluff. Okay? If you look up the reference in Tacitus, you will find nothing about Quirinius in Syria. No dates, hardly anything at all about Quirinius's political career. He's mentioned as a person, but we don't get details from Tacitus. If we look in Suetonius, we find absolutely nothing at all. If we look in the third out of the four sources, Strabo has a very brief mention of Quirinius in the war against the Hamanadenses and nothing else. So these claims about when Quirinius governed Syria is not documented in multiple different sources.
Oh, sneaky.
It's only in Josephus. But again, how many biblical scholars accept the claims and tell us that there's an intractable problem here? We have to wait to find some new historical evidence, but the way it is, it looks really bad because they don't bother to check. Don't trust liberal scholars. Do not. Verify. Check the sources.
Okay, so the date of him becoming governor of Syria in 60 is just from Antiquities then?
It's only from Josephus. And that puts a very different spin on it, doesn't it? Because liberal scholars want you to see it this way. Luke commits an error because he has Jesus' birth taking place while Quirinius was governing Syria, although he didn't govern Syria until AD 6. How is it actually now?
Luke and Josephus disagree on when Quirinius governed Syria.
Yeah, that's the most you can say. Luke and Josephus disagree on when Quirinius governed Syria. See, liberal scholars want to teach, without mentioning it, the inspiration and inerrancy of Josephus. Now, only when it suits their purposes to undermine the Bible. But Josephus is by no means inerrant. The reality here is, if indeed Josephus puts Quirinius at AD 6, and we haven't established that yet, but even if he did, what we have here is Luke disagreeing with Josephus. Why we should assume that Josephus is correct and therefore Luke is wrong is not something that these scholars tell us. It's not Luke versus the facts, it's Luke versus Josephus. And the simple question, who is the more reliable historian? Well, liberal scholars have operated for a long time trying to convince us that Luke is not reliable. And through the years, many accusations were brought against things that Luke recorded in his books on the basis that these were not known to history, they were not recorded, they were not even possible. One prominent example is Luke's statement in Acts 18:12 that Gallio was proconsul of Achaia. The skeptics told us that Gallio never governed Achaia since he is not mentioned in any Roman list, and the title proconsul of Achaia, by the way, is impossible. In Luke 3:1, Luke tells us that at this time Lysanias was tetrarch of Abilene. And this is an error, the liberals told us, because Lysanias died in the year 36 BC. Luke talks about the polytarchs in Acts chapter 17, verse 6. And liberal skeptics told us here's another error from Luke. Such a title was never used for city authorities. And the list goes on. Acts 19:35, Luke refers to the temple guardians, the Neokaros in Ephesus. We were told this title is impossible. Luke mentions a proconsul in Cyprus in Acts 13:7 and 8 and 12. Liberal skeptics told us this title is impossible. It was not known from Roman writings. The idea that we knew everything that the Romans used from the writings we had, of course, never really made sense. But these were the
we do have a lot of writings from the Romans, though, don't we?
We do, but by no means all of it or half of it. We'll see that as we move on. Acts 28:7, Luke mentions the leader in Malta is called the first man of the island, and here too we were told that this is impossible. But in fact, subsequent archaeological discoveries vindicated Luke in every single one of these cases, every single one.
Maybe that's something like what Daniel Wallace or whoever it was hoping would be discovered to fix this supposedly intractable problem.
Yes, the problem is there an intractable problem? The difference is that Wallace thinks that we have hard historical evidence contradicting what Luke says. In this case, the arguments were always arguments from silence. They weren't setting evidence against what Luke said. They never had a statement, ancient statement saying Gallio never was proconsul of Achaia. It was always an argument from silence. That's the difference. So, speaking of Gallio, they told us that Gallio never governed Achaia since he was not listed in any of the Roman lists. Further, confidently maintained that the title proconsul of Achaia was impossible. So Luke is clearly not a reliable historian, they crowed, until an inscription was discovered at Delphi in 1908 that dated to the year AD 51 and identified Gallio by name and called him proconsul. Remember, that's the title we were told was impossible, and yet that was the title found on that inscription that dated to the year AD 51. Gallio's tenure was short-lived, beginning in AD 51, ending in AD 52, which may explain why it was not mentioned on the lists. Lysanias, Tetrarch of Abilene, we were told that this has to be a mistake since Lysanias died in 36 BC. And they kept insisting on that until an inscription dated between AD 14 and 29 was found at Abila that mentioned Lysanias the Tetrarch.
So it was a different Lysanias?
Must have been a second Lysanias, which is not at all unusual to think that that could have happened. But this inscription tells us that, yes, at the very time Luke says Lysanias was Tetrarch of Abilene or Abila, we now have hard contemporary inscriptional evidence telling us, yeah, Luke is right. And remember, the liberals told us that's not possible. Luke is not trustworthy. Wow, Luke is right. The Polytarchs in Thessalonica were told that they never used this title, and they kept saying that until an inscription that dated between the years AD 69 and 79 was found in 1835 in Thessalonica, in that very city, that listed the Polytarchs of that city using the name that liberals told us was impossible. They didn't use that title. Since then, a total of 19 inscriptions have been found using the title Polytarch, 5 of them in Thessalonica. So you might want to think twice before you accept the claims of liberal scholars on the basis of arguments from silence. As the great archaeologist Sir William Ramsay points out, and here's a fellow who explored the Holy Land for many, many years trying to disprove the Bible and ended up believing it because Luke was so accurate. He tells us that all in all, Luke names 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands without making a single error. No other Greco-Roman historian even comes close in terms of accuracy.
Including Josephus?
Certainly including Josephus. We'll look at Josephus' accuracy in a moment. Ramsay writes specifically, Luke's history is unsurpassed in respect to its trustworthiness. Luke is a historian of the first rank. Not merely are his statements trustworthy, this author should be placed along with the very greatest of historians. Acts could bear the most minute scrutiny as an authority for the facts of the Aegean world, and that it was written with such a judgment, skill, art, and perception of truth as to be a model of historical statement. You may press the words of Luke in a degree beyond any other historians, and they stand the keenest scrutiny and the hardest treatment. On the other hand, since you mentioned Josephus, what have historians and scholars found about Josephus' writings? Josephus' accuracy, we've already seen one mistake, by the way, where we said about the Olympia could not have matched the rule of those 2 people he mentioned. Josephus' accuracy and reliability as a historian have been challenged repeatedly. His free interpretation of his sources and his embellishments of the biblical record. He had a habit of overstating for dramatic purposes. Josephus also had trouble with numbers, uncritically accepting and then transmitting augmented statistics. Mount Tabor, for example, tops 30 stadia or 18,200 feet in Josephus, when in fact it was only 1,920.
Well, if that is the case, does that mean we can't trust what Josephus said about Jesus' resurrection?
No, I don't think you can. Well, if he mentions particular data, such as, oh, Jesus weighed this many pounds when he rose from the dead, then, yeah, you could question that.
Well, but if he was, could someone say, well, he was dramatizing things when he said that he rose from the dead?
You could possibly say that, but then you'd wonder why a Jew would dramatize something saying the exact opposite of what he wants to believe. He'd be acting as a witness against interest in that case. Now, don't get me wrong, like Josephus is not a discardable source. You have to handle him carefully, but that's the case with all ancient historians, and for that matter, modern historians too. But it doesn't mean that you throw it out willy-nilly because they make mistakes here and there. What you have to understand is they did make mistakes here and there. They weren't perfect. Luke is as close to perfect as you can get.
And certainly anything he wrote in the Bible is inspired, so those parts of what he wrote must be perfect.
Well, exactly, and that's why when it's a battle between trusting Luke or trusting Josephus, you need to go with Luke. But continuing on about Josephus, at times he is inconsistent in statements made in the Jewish war when compared with those in Antiquities. The discrepancies between the Jewish war and his Vita, however, are more serious. They include irreconcilable versions. So he will contradict himself. Now, there's probably about more than 20 years between when he wrote the Jewish war and when he wrote the Antiquities. So yeah, he might have forgotten some details, misremembered them. Discrepancies between the Jewish war and his Vita. Well, Vita is his own autobiography, so yes, he might want to make himself look better there. But the point here is that the idea that you can look at a discrepancy between Luke and Josephus and say, Josephus is right, Luke must be wrong, simply cannot be sustained. Furthermore, even apart from that, we do note that Luke is considerably closer in time to the events he describes. Okay, and well within eyewitness times. These people that he's mentioning, most likely he was alive for all of them, but certainly for some of them, Josephus wasn't. We note that the manuscript attestation for the Gospel according to Luke is vastly superior to that for the writings of Josephus. And again, Luke is a much more careful and much more accurate historian. So in light of these facts, the default assumption when Luke and Josephus disagree should be that Luke is right. Luke should be considered correct. Okay? The fact that he is not, including in the matter of Quirinius, is simply because liberal scholars are looking for an excuse to dismiss the Bible. It's not an even-handed dealing with the evidence. It doesn't seem to matter to them whether their conclusions are valid or not. If we had nothing more to say on this, this would already be enough. Luke wasn't wrong about the date of the census. Josephus was wrong. And again, he's the only one they can adduce for that supposed date. Those other sources that they mention do not, in fact, deal with the date of Quirinius governing Syria. So if we had nothing more to say, it would be enough. The Bible is right, but there is more. Now, before we continue with the question of Luke versus Josephus, I'd like to look at three more claims that are made by skeptics, three more charges against the Christmas account, three more bases on which they say there could not have been a census of the sort described in Luke. And these three charges are as follows. Number one, there is no historical record of a census of the entire Roman world. Censuses were done piecemeal and involved only Roman citizens. Number two, no Roman census would have been made in Judea during the reign of Herod. And number three, Roman censuses did not require people to return to their ancestral homes, but to where they owned property. Now, the second one of these we can do away with immediately. The idea was that Herod, as a client king, would not have been subject to a Roman census. But in point of fact, in 4 BC, Herod angered Augustus, and Augustus changed his status from friend of Caesar to subject. So if any time after 4 BC, indeed, the Romans could have made a census in Judea. So that second charge already, we can disregard that one. But we move on to the first charge, which is that there was no historical record of a census of the entire Roman world. Censuses were done piecemeal and involved only Roman citizens.
Isn't that just an argument from silence?
It is an argument from silence. Now, as you recall, arguments from silence may be weak or they may be strong. When is an argument from silence weak and when is it strong?
I guess it's strong when there's a circumstance where you expect to have documentation, but weak when you don't.
Exactly. An argument from silence, the strength of it depends on how much we would expect to find evidence for it if it actually happened. And in this particular objection, the skeptics are overlooking a huge point. It's based on the assumption that, in fact, we have a complete record of Roman history. And so if we don't have a record of a census, it couldn't have happened. But this is not even close to the truth. We are nowhere close to having a complete record of Roman history. If we look at the Roman historians, the well-known historians, Polybius, for example, only about 1/3 of his works remain. Diodorus wrote 40 books of history. We have only 16 of them. Dio Cassius wrote more than 80 books. We have only 5 of them and fragments of 2 more. Livy, the very famous historian, wrote a 142-volume history of Rome. 142 volumes, only 35 of them have come down to us. Tacitus is credited with the histories and with the annals. About half of these remain. Nepos, he's the author of the earliest surviving Latin biographies. He wrote 16 of them. All we have left to us is 1 book and part of a second. Varro, who was considered the greatest Roman scholar and polymath because he wrote hundreds of books. All we have left from him is 1 book and part of a second, and that's it. So, what becomes obvious when we look at it is we have lost an awful lot of Roman history. We know a lot, but what we know is a small part of all that happened. And furthermore, the period we're looking at is particularly poorly attested. Sir Ronald Syme, who is widely regarded as the 20th century's greatest historian of ancient Rome, says this: by a quirk of fate, the years around the date of the Nativity are very poorly recorded by Roman historians. Syme, that's who we mentioned, Syme has called the years 6 BC to AD 4 this obscure decade. And that's recorded by John Thorley in Greece and Rome, 2nd series, volume 28, number 1. So Roman history is incomplete, but particularly in this decade, from 6 BC to AD 4 is very, very, very poorly recorded. We have very little left. It's an obscure decade. Therefore, to say that we have no record of a census outside of Luke doesn't mean there was no census at all. Do you think that this is a good argument?
You mean the argument that they advanced or
Yes.
their defense? No, of course not.
I'm surprised they would actually advance such an argument. And again, remember, they say that, well, there's no historical record of the census. Well, there is, and it's in Luke. Now, they can say that, well, Luke is wrong, but remember all of these things that we saw, all of the things that Luke recorded faithfully, that skeptics said was impossible, couldn't have happened. There was no Gallio. There was the ruler of Achaia was not called a proconsul. Lysanias died too early. Polytarchs, that term was never used. Temple guardians was never used. First man, that, and so on. And on every single one of them, the argument was from silence, that we have no record of these. And in every single case, Luke was right. So the idea that we should say that Luke is wrong, there was no census because we haven't found other evidence for it, sorry, it's a non-starter. We have the evidence from Luke, and he has shown himself to be a completely reliable historian. Now, we should note that there are a couple of tantalizing bits of evidence that may actually be corroborative of what Luke has said. In Res Gestae Divi Augusti, section 25.2, we read that Augustus actually took a nationwide oath of allegiance. This was not for counting population, it was not for taxation, it was a nationwide oath of allegiance when he became emperor in 27 BC. He's essentially done away with the republic. He's replaced it with an empire, himself as the emperor. And he wants to make sure he has the people on his side. In Res Gestae Divi Augusti, it says, the whole of Italy voluntarily swore allegiance to me and demanded me as the leader after the war in which I was victorious at Actium. That's where Antony and Cleopatra were defeated. Now, 2 BC was actually the Silver Jubilee of Augustus's reign and the 750th anniversary of the founding of Rome. It was an occasion for major celebrations. The Roman Senate conferred upon Augustus the title Pater Patriae, Father of the Country. Now, this would have been an auspicious occasion for redoing the empire-wide oath of loyalty. People would be registered, not for taxes, but for an oath. The word used in the Greek in Luke is apographe, which is simply registration. Now, if such a thing were done, the decree would have gone out in 3 BC to be done in time for the Silver Jubilee. So indeed, there might have been an empire-wide, even if censuses weren't normally done empire-wide, this would have been an occasion for an empire-wide registration, such as is described in Luke. Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah. Is there any evidence for this?
No, that's the question. It seems reasonable. Is there any kind of corroborative evidence for this idea? Well, again, in Res Gestae Divi Augusti, section 6.35, we read, while I was administering my 13th consulship, the Senate and the equestrian order and the entire Roman people gave me the title Father of my country. Now, how do the entire Roman people give approval for the title without a registration for an oath? And again, any evidence that such a thing was done? Well, it's mentioned here, an inscription from 3 BC, found at Paphlagonia in north-central Asia Minor, where we read, in 3 BC, an oath of obedience was, quote, taken by the inhabitants of Paphlagonia and the Roman businessmen dwelling among them. The same oath was sworn also by all the people in the land, Romans and non-citizens, all the people, at the altars of Augustus and the temples of Augustus in the various districts. So there's, right from that very period, 3 BC, this oath of obedience that was for all of the people, Romans and non-Romans. It's also mentioned by the 5th century Armenian historian Moses of Chorini, and he puts it into the 2nd year of Abgar, king of Armenia, which again is 3 BC.
So you think Mary and Joseph would have gone to a temple of Augustus to swear an oath?
Well, it wouldn't have been a temple of Augustus because there was no temple of Augustus in Bethlehem or, for that matter, anywhere in Judea. Where he's talking about those places had the temple, so that's where it would go. Now, Osorius, early 5th century, tells us this. Augustus ordered that a census be taken of each province everywhere, and that all men be enrolled. This is the earliest and most famous public acknowledgement which marked Caesar as the first of all men, and the Romans as lords of the world, a published list of all men entered individually. This first and greatest census was taken, since in this one name of Caesar all the peoples of the great nations took oath, and at the same time through the participation in the census were made a part of one society. And that's, again, early 5th century, Orosius, section 6.22 and section 7.2. Orosius actually produced the longest surviving summary of the whole range of ancient Roman history, covering over 11 centuries from before the foundation of the city up until Orosius' own time. So the skeptics who say there's no record of a census and there wouldn't be empire-wide, no record, well, there it is. It's right there in Orosius.
Yeah, I don't know. It seems like everybody's heard of writers like Livy or Caesar or Cicero, but I didn't even hear of Orosius.
There's an awful lot of writers from many different places. So yes, but if you're going to attack Luke, you need to do your homework on this. Now, if there was this census around this time, is there any indication that the Jews were included? Well, yes, there is. Josephus in Antiquities, section 17.3.1, the whole Jewish nation took an oath to be faithful to Caesar and to the interests of the king. So there you go. Jews were part of it. Now, a couple of other points about this oath of loyalty. While most people went into their own city to register, because that was another charge saying that they wouldn't have to go to Bethlehem. Yes, they would. While most people went into their own city to register, particular attention would have been paid to anyone with a legitimate claim to a throne. In Judea, that would be those with royal connections to David. They would have been required to go to Bethlehem to register so Herod could know who his potential rivals were.
How do we know this?
Because Bethlehem is the city of David. David was the great king. If there's going to be a rival, he's going to be coming from Bethlehem.
I mean, how do we know that particular attention was paid to someone with a claim to the throne?
That was generally the way things were done in those days. Often, in fact, if often got bloody, if you seized the throne, you would kill off everybody with any kind of connection to the previous dynasty. The reason that you read about eunuchs, particularly in the Old Testament, emperors and kings would have eunuchs serving, is to make sure there's no chance of them possibly having relations with a queen or somebody from the royal family to establish a claim to the throne. So they're very, very careful about these things, very careful to make sure that all of their rivals are at best controlled and monitored, and if necessary, wiped out, which you see Herod doing once he gets news of Jesus being born the King of the Jews. He wipes out all of the boys 2 and under in Bethlehem to make sure he's not going to be having any potential rivals. And finally, we know from the genealogies that Joseph and Mary were both descendants of David, so yes, they would both be required to go there. On documentation on that, it's in Ernest Martin's book, The Star of Bethlehem. So, these objections that have been raised disappear. The idea there's no historical record of a census of the entire Roman world is A, an argument from silence and therefore, in this case, irrelevant, and B, it's not true. There is a record. The idea that Roman censuses did not require people to return to their ancestral homes wouldn't necessarily be the case either. That's, I think, an invented charge. So having answered those charges that are brought against this story and shown that they are without foundation, let's return to the issue of the census of Quirinius. Now, we're told that according to Josephus, Quirinius the governor conducted a census for taxation in the year AD 6. Now, if Luke 2:2 is translated as this registration was before Quirinius was governor of Syria, there's no supposed contradiction. It can certainly legitimately be translated that way, unless you're following the critical Greek text, as most evangelical scholars do, and most modern translations of the Bible do. In that case, as Daniel Walsh pointed out, pretty much impossible to translate it that way. This is an example of the problem that textual criticism leads into when it comes to biblical inerrancy, but we'll discuss that in detail in other programs. Right now, we can say that, in fact, the text as we have it can be translated legitimately. This registration was before Quirinius was governor of Syria, and the problem is solved. But we can also point out that even if Josephus is correct, it actually does not rule out an earlier registration conducted by him somewhere in 3 to 2 BC. But here's the thing. We're told that if it's 3 to 2 BC, is there a reason to believe that Quirinius was governor of Syria in 3 to 2 BC? Well, if we look carefully at the wording of Luke 2:2, we read, this census first took place while Quirinius was governing Syria. If you look at the actual Greek, what do you see there, Sonia?
A genitive absolute. Hegemon nuontos. Genitive present participle.
Participle, exactly. So what would that mean then?
When you have this kind of construction, we often will translate as some kind of adverbial clause, but you have to use your judgment as to what kind. Like, is it just temporal? When? Is it causal? Because? Is it consensus although? And so on. Yeah.
In this case, New King James translates it as this census first took place while Quirinius was hegemon nuontos, governing Syria. It doesn't actually say he was the governor. It doesn't say he had the title. What is the meaning of this particular verb we're looking at? Hegumonuo.
According to the lexicon, to exercise an administrative position, be leader, command, rule, order.
Yeah, so it has to do with him doing something rather than having a specific title. What we see in Luke 2:2 doesn't mean that Quirinius necessarily had the formal title of governor, but only that he was commanding or exercising official authority. Now, from the historical records that we do have of Quirinius, what was he doing during this time? The Cambridge Ancient History, Volume 10, tells us that each province had its equestrian procurator, who in the eyes of the provincials was almost as important as the governor himself. So each province actually had a procurator as well as a governor. John Thorley, When Was Jesus Born, in the journal Greece and Rome, 2nd series, tells us that Quirinius was actually procurator of Syria, based on what Justin Martyr in Apology 1.34 tells us. He says that the imperial records stated that Quirinius was procurator of Syria, not governor.
Okay, what's a procurator?
Procurator was one of the two people appointed as authorities. Pontius Pilate, you recall, was procurator of Judea. So there's difference in titles, but not really difference in function. Both of them exercised official authority. So both of those could be considered to be doing the hegemonuo, okay? Because that's a verb, it's not a title. So there's no problem about Quirinius not being the governor at the time, as long as he is governing or exercising authority in official capacity. And he did that. In addition to being procurator at that time, all the way from 12 BC, he was a consul. He was the supreme military commander of the eastern provinces. He seemed to be a troubleshooter for Rome, given a special command to prosecute the Homonadensian War between 10 and 5 BC. Apparently did it very well. Later assigned as guardian to Gaius Caesar, heir to the throne. So there's no problem seeing him exercising his authority and given the command to carry out this registration.
Oh, so that should be enough to solve the whole problem then.
Well, it does. So if we sum up what we've seen so far, the charge that Matthew and Luke contradict each other about the birth of Jesus, as Matthew has it happen before Herod's death in 4 BC, while Luke has it at the time that Quirinius was governor of Syria. That didn't happen until AD 6. We've seen that none of those claims, none of the elements is actually true. The evidence is rather conclusive that Herod died in 1 BC, not 4 BC. We saw that the data in Josephus has to actually be tortured to get a 4 BC date. At best, some of them will point to 1 BC, some might point to 3 BC, but there's no lunar eclipse in 3 BC, so they had to draw back 1 year earlier to make it 4 BC, so that's not what Josephus says. And the only lunar eclipse in 4 BC was too faint to have been noted. The only thing that seemed to carry any weight was that his sons seemed to count their reigns from 4 BC, but Josephus tells us that they were already kings before Herod died, so that last objection to dating Herod's death to 1 BC disappears. We saw that there were claims that there was no worldwide census ordered by Caesar at the time of Jesus' birth, and had there been one, Joseph would not have been required to travel to Bethlehem, and Mary also would not have had to go with him. We saw that every one of these claims are bogus. We saw that the decade, well, Roman history in general, is not nearly as well recorded, as complete as we would like. And this decade in particular was so poorly recorded that the absence of evidence for any specific event in that period cannot be considered significant. Even so, we saw there several lines of evidence that indicate that there was, in fact, an empire-wide registration for an oath of loyalty in 3 to 2 BC, which fits the biblical timeline for the birth of Jesus perfectly. We saw it reasonable that those who had royal ancestry, such as both Joseph and Mary did, may well have been required to go to their royal ancestral hometowns for the registration so that the authorities could know who had a potential claim to the throne. We can't prove that for a fact, but then it's being set against an argument from silence anyway. And then we saw finally that there's reason to believe that Quirinius may indeed have been governing in 3 to 2 BC, specifically perhaps acting on a command to conduct the registration. At any rate, he was there. Now, let's suppose you're the liberal skeptic, Let's suppose he wants to ignore all of this and still insist that Luke is contradicted by Josephus. Well, as we pointed out earlier, it becomes a question of who is the more reliable historian, Luke or Josephus. And we've already amply shown how Luke is an extremely accurate historian. He is in the very forefront of ancient historians. Sir William Ramsay tells us that from his decades of investigation in the Holy Land, which means that even initially we should prefer his testimony over that of Josephus, because Josephus was not nearly as careful an historian. And something particularly interesting about Josephus' occasional carelessness, a scholar named John H. Rhodes did a very interesting analysis of Josephus. It was published in Journal of the Evangelical Theological Society, volume 54, number 1, in the year 2011. Now, he wasn't trying to vindicate Luke at all. He was simply doing a study of source criticism of Josephus. In other words, analyzing the sources he used, since he was not himself an eyewitness to these events. And he makes this claim: Josephus misstated the census of Quirinius. And that's the whole basis of this charge, that Luke got the date of Quirinius wrong because it disagrees with Josephus. And here are scholars telling us Josephus was wrong about the date of the census.
Okay, but John, you're always telling us that we can't just believe what a scholar says because he's a scholar and that they must provide evidence. Did Daniel Schwartz provide any evidence?
Indeed he does. That's a good point to make. We always insist there has to be evidence. Let's look at the evidence for this. Now, first, here's what he points out. During the last 25 years, Daniel Schwartz and others have developed some fruitful insights into the historiography of Josephus, which have highlighted the susceptibility of Josephus to mistaken duplications and to reporting contemporaneous events from different sources as if they happened at different times. The account which Josephus tells of the census conducted by Quirinius and the corresponding revolt by Judas the Galilean is actually one of these, a mistaken duplication, broadly speaking, of events which occurred much earlier. The census began before Herod's death. Well, why is it a mistaken duplication? Because Josephus describes an earlier census, supposedly done by Sabinus. And here's the problem. When you compare Josephus' account of this first census in his book with what he puts as a second census under Quirinius, if we would believe that these are two different censuses, we would have to believe this. We would have to believe that two insurgents against Herod were active within weeks of each other around the time of Herod's death. We'd have to believe that both of these insurgents were named Judas. Both were connected with Sepphoris, a city near Nazareth. Both were nicknamed in connection with a famous father. One was executed by Herod the Great for raiding Herod's temple, and the other waited 10 years after raiding Herod's armory to adopt the same manner and substance of teaching as the first. We would have to believe that the second was opposed by the very same high priest who had opposed the earlier Judas, even though this high priest was reportedly deposed twice during those 10 years. So you'd have all these amazing coincidences. The similarity between Sabinus and Quirinius in both title and activity must be just as coincidental as he refers to another example of Josephus taking two different accounts of one event and thinking that they're two different events, Judas and Joazar.
Okay, so how do we know that the Quirinius one is the mistake then and not the Sabinus one?
The point is that this is clearly a repeat of an earlier one. He's taken, unless we think that all of these things happen exactly in these coincidental fashions, he described an earlier census, one that was done while Herod was still alive, and then, based perhaps on a different account of it, he repeats exactly the same thing.
But how do we know which of the two is the right one?
It doesn't matter. The point is we have, as we've seen, other evidence that the biblical date for the census is right. So if Josephus has two that are clearly two, one is a mistaken one, then if we decide which one, it's based on the other evidence we've already seen that puts the census to 3 to 2 BC. It would make no sense to simply, well, let's assume he got the second one right and not the first one. We'll assume that in order to set that against the actual evidence we've seen in order to keep trying to say that Luke got it wrong. There'll be no evidence for that assumption. So the conclusion of all this then is that the charge that there's an irreconcilable contradiction between Matthew and Luke regarding the birth date of Jesus is nonsense. Luke's testimony of a worldwide registration in 3 to 2 BC is fully consistent with the evidence we have, and this occurred before Herod's death in 1 BC. And this is why we need elite level apologetics to answer even the supposedly most intractable problems as we've done here. We need to stop listening to people who just give in and accept liberal presuppositions without question. We need to take inerrancy seriously.
Thank you for listening to the Truth in My Days podcast with John Torse. If you like our content, please share this information with family and friends. It helps us a lot. We also would love to hear from you. You can reach us on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube by searching Truth in My Days as one word again. Truth in My Days as one word. No spaces in between. Or reach us by email at info@truthinmydays.com. You may also visit our website for more comprehensive material and to learn more about our ministry. Our website is truthinmydays.com. Thank you.